Hi, welcome to this bonus episode of My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graban. Today we have a returning guest, as we often do here, to talk about a book that's come to be since her episode. So today we are joined again by Jen Heemstra. She is from Washington University in St. Louis. She's the Charles Allen Thomas Professor of Chemistry. She's chair of the chemistry department. And she was our guest back in episode 262. So there'll be a link to that in the show notes if you didn't hear her first appearance. But Jen, welcome back to the podcast. Hope you're doing well.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's wonderful to see you again.
Well, it's great to see you, and great to hear about the book you available now. And we had you had mentioned it back in the episode. So the book, I'll mention the title, is Lab Work to Leadership, a concise guide to thriving in the science job you weren't trained for. So tell us a little bit about how things evolved from your first episode.
I'd love to do that. And it's actually so perfect to be talking to you about the book, because this book really came about and reflects my greatest mistake, which was that I ended up in this job being a chemistry professor and a chemistry researcher because I thought I was getting this science job or research job. And the mistake I made was not realizing that as going into that career path, I would end up leading a lab and thus having a leadership job that I wasn't trained for. Yeah. And for me, that was a really great mistake, because it turns out that I actually really, really, really love the research piece. I will say that while the experience of making that mistake is pretty universal in my field, it's maybe not universally viewed as such a great or happy mistake by everyone, but it's a mistake that we all have to deal with. And so it was a chance for me to say, hey, I actually really love all of this leadership stuff. I'm a very people-focused person. And so for my colleagues out there who find themselves in these roles and realize they need these skills, but they don't, they're busy. They don't have the time, or they don't enjoy it as much to dive into the literature and try to, sift out what they can find to bring into practice in leading their lab. I figured I'll just write a book. And so it's kind of like a friend-to-friend conversation of, if two colleagues were just sitting and talking about leadership and mentorship over drinks, and I'm going to make it really quick and easy for my colleagues. They're busy people. They just want something quick hitting that applies to their life of leading a science lab. But it was a chance for me to actually dig into the business and psychology literature more and think about what I could bring to my field to say, hey, people are counting on you to get this leadership thing right. And I'm going to give you this concise guide that's not going to talk down to you, but also isn't going to be too stodgy. And we're all in this together, and let's figure out all together how to be better leaders for the people counting on us.
Yeah. So for people working in labs and the sciences, I could see where that would be helpful. As an engineer, I'll say, there are parallels to going from engineering individual roles into leadership. My friends who work in medical professions are often faced with that same challenge, where they're given an opportunity that they weren't necessarily seeking out. And I remember back in your episode, you were calling that accidental leadership. That was sort of a working title for the book, or just how you described your situation?
That was the working title for the book. And in fact, when my publisher came to me to change the title, I was initially very resistant, because I felt like, when I would say the words accidental leadership to people, they just immediately got it. And they would, I knew it was good because they would immediately start laughing, because they knew exactly what I was talking about. But then in the end, I was actually much happier with the new title that we have, because it is much more descriptive. It's more aimed at my target audience. But the encouraging thing, it's so encouraging for me to hear from you that this applies in your field of engineering, or you see it in medical care. I've heard that from so many people as I've talked to them about the book. I was talking to someone who was a lawyer, and I try to be gracious and say, oh, I know that it's just academic science that has this issue. And the number of people who say, oh, no. Like in law, we have this problem too. In fact, my lawyer friends should read your book. I'm hoping that it might be fairly universal and really resonate with a lot of people across different sectors.
Yeah, and I think free suggestion for what it's worth. I mean, that phrase "accidental leadership" is one that you could probably still throw around as a hook, or as if you're doing other articles or podcast appearances, because I think that resonates, and maybe the did the publisher think maybe lab work to leadership was a little more positive?
I think that they wanted it to be more specific to the sciences. And in the end, I like the change, because where we would see this being used a lot, we're hoping that a lot of individual accidental leaders will find it and say, wow, this could be helpful for me. But then I'm also seeing it being picked up by people who want to distribute it to, a whole group. So everyone who's in a leadership training program. And I put myself in the shoes of, if I'm a university leader buying this for all of, say, my new science faculty, a title like accidental leadership might, seem a little bit informal, or might seem a little bit too off the cuff, or like I don't trust them to be doing their jobs well. And so lab work to leadership felt like, okay, if I was a vice provost buying, 40 copies of this for my faculty, you could feel a little bit better about giving them a book with that title. So that's how I actually got excited about where we ended up. And then in the end, they put chemical structures on the cover, which is like the way to any chemist's heart.
Yeah.
And they let me even choose the structures in the end. I was able to say, hey, can I mess with these and make them structures that mean something to me? And so the one that's kind of front and center on the cover is a molecule called inosine, or it's actually technically hypoxanthine, but it's part of the inosine nucleotide, and that's a big part of our research. So the chance, they know how to get to an organic chemist's heart. They're like, hey, we changed your title, but look, chemical structures, and so I absolutely love that.
I see the image of a paper airplane with chemical structures on it. It wouldn't be like an inside joke in some way. It's just a meaningful chemical structure, right?
Yeah, if you aren't a chemist, you probably just look at it and say, oh yeah, okay, she's a chemist. Those are chemical structures. But for people who are in my research lab or in my research field, they would see that and say, oh, like I know that's the molecule that her lab works on. And so that's actually pretty fun.
I was in a coffee shop recently for the first time, and they had, I believe it, they had a label. It was like the caffeine molecule in like a neon sign on the back wall, which is perfectly fitting for them.
Exactly. Yeah. I have friends who have like little caffeine necklaces or whatever. Exactly.
Well, I mean, I'm drinking coffee right now, so
we all rely on it pretty heavily. But it was fun to be able to work in a few molecules that had some sort of personal meaning to me, but I also tried to do that in a way that stuck with the artistic flair of what was there.
Yeah. So maybe a final question for you, and again, joined again by Jen Heemstra. The book is Lab Work to Leadership. I mean, it sounds like one target audience is people who have ended up in a leadership role and are trying to navigate that. Hopefully the book also gives confidence to people. Like, how often, here's the question, like, how often do you find somebody turn down a leadership role where hopefully this book would give them more confidence to take that on and do it well?
That's a really great question, and definitely part of my target audience and people who I'm hoping might read it are people who are considering those leadership roles in the future. In fact, a lot of people I've heard from who are already reading it are people who are still in their training experience. They're graduate students or postdoctoral researchers who are then planning to go on to be a leader in academia or industry or somewhere else. And they want to start equipping themselves with these skills now so that they can be successful at it. And hopefully there might be people who are a little on the fence about their career choice and might read it and might be more encouraged to pursue those career paths. But one of the things I was actually most passionate about, including in the book, and I think really set it apart from the other books in this space, is that there is a whole section. So there's 3 sections, leading yourself well and then leading others well. And that's the pretty standard fare. But then the third section is to say, okay, now if you're a leader who's training other future leaders, in my sector, everyone that I work with is going to go on and be a leader in some way or another. Instead of just perpetuating this cycle where they then get there and don't know what they're doing, we can actually take everything that we're learning and we can be training them in leadership right now, so that when they get into these jobs, they actually feel prepared for it. So I think it hopefully is going to have this sort of multiplier effect, that it can really impact a lot of people, even if they never read the book.
Yeah. Well, again, congratulations on getting the book
Thanks.
over the finish line, and it's out there, available now. There will be links in the show notes or the YouTube description. But again, go seek it out. It's Lab Work to Leadership, a concise guide to thriving in the science job you weren't trained for. So again, Jen Heemstra, thank you so much for coming back and joining us.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to see you.